But it wasn't just a resume that really impressed me. It was the idea that he really understands the everyday lives of people. As mayor, he gets to see his constituents on a day-to-day basis. And he has a specific worldview that really resonates with me. So for example, in a Vanity Fair article, he said, "I may not be able to convince every voter out there to be for me, but at the very least, I need to make sure every voter out there knows I'm for them." And I thought, yeah, that's absolutely true. Absolutely true. One other quick quotation from Time magazine. He said, "If the substance of your ideas is progressive, but there's mistrust about them among conservatives, you have three choices. One is just to change your ideas and make them more conservative. The second is to be sort of sneaky and try to make it seem like your ideas are more conservative than they actually are. And the third, the approach I favor, is to stick to your ideas, but explain why conservatives shouldn't be afraid of them." And I think that's exactly right. We've gotten used to the politics of tearing down other people. The current president, does not lift people up. And we on the left, or we progressives, Democrats, liberals, maybe moderates, maybe independents, are a little bit guilty of this too. We hear things like, "Oh, he's just gay. He's just the gay candidate. He's just 37. He's just a mayor." But the more you read and hear about Mayor Pete, you realize he's not just anything. He is remarkable. There's something intangible, grounded, and sincere about this candidate. I know you feel it too, that's why you're here. So again, thank you for coming. And just to summarize and sort of to wrap up, I tried to think about my ideal president. I'm a professor of American politics and I teach the presidency. So I like to think I have somewhat of a different view. And the kinds of things that I want in a president: someone who realizes that complexity isn't a vice, someone who isn't intimidated by details, someone who is inherently kind, inclusive, and empathetic, someone that reads, someone who thinks critically about policy, someone who admits when they do something wrong and says that they're going to learn from that experience. And maybe my favorite, someone who uses executive time for executive functions. So in short, we need a president who will turn the page on the politics that we've gotten used to stop battling for the lowest common denominator, and in Pete's words, someone who will change the channel. And I think that's absolutely what we need right now. So I long for a president that I can be proud of, and someone who is in turn proud of us. I know who that person is. You know who that person is. I'm happy to welcome him here. It's Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks. Every now and then you get an introduction so kind and so well put together that you kind of hesitate to get up and speak because you kind of just want that to be the general impression that people get. But I'll try to share a few thoughts with you. And then since we've got a pretty intimate group here, at least by presidential fundraiser standards, we actually have the luxury of being able to have a bit of a conversation too. But thank you so much for making this event a big success. And thanks, of course, Brian and Sean for having us over, welcoming us. Thanks to Jim Guerin who helped bring this together. I think State Senator Dibble is here. Oh, there you are. Thanks for being here. My longtime friend and fellow mayor, Betsy Hodges, thanks for being here. Mayors love talking to other mayors about mayor stuff, so you always feel better when there's another mayor in the room. And I want to acknowledge DNC Midwest Caucus Chair Ron Harris as well for joining us. So it turns out that a millennial Midwestern mayor actually has a pretty good standing to run for president of the United States right now. Yeah. We didn't know that would necessarily be true when we got into this. I just thought that there was a moment that called for something different than what we've had before. But these very same attributes that made my candidacy unlikely are, I think, the reason why we've been doing so much better than we expected to do when we first got into this. First of all, the idea of a mayor, maybe not so far-fetched at a moment when we're beginning to realize we want Washington to start looking more like our best-run cities and towns rather than the other way around. One thing you don't see in local government is a city government shutting down because of an ideological disagreement among its leaders. It's unthinkable. I mean, we deliver water and you need water to live. So things like that just don't happen. And we're at a moment right now where some of the on-the-ground mentality that local leaders bring would, I think, serve us very well in Washington. We're also at a moment when there's something to be said for our part of the country, the American Midwest, being at the forefront of the American Democratic Party, too. I know I'm preaching to the choir on that one. But people don't always think of the Midwest when they think of the Democratic Party, and they don't always think of the Democratic Party when they think about the politics of the Midwest. And yet it's our part of the country that has such a rich and deep progressive tradition. And I think it's our part of the country that holds a lot of the answers for where the rest of the country needs to go. In particular, stories from communities like mine, an industrial Midwestern community that was almost left for dead at the beginning of this decade, written up as one of America's dying cities. But really any community, whether it's industrial or rural, any community where people grow up taking on board that message that the only way you can succeed is to get out. People need to hear a different kind of message from that community. I found purpose, I found meaning, and I found a chance to make a difference in my hometown. I spent a decade traveling around the world only to realize that the greatest adventures lay very close to home. Even more importantly, our city's turnaround, our city's growth, is a powerful reply to a president who thinks the only way to reach our part of the country is through resentment and nostalgia and an unkeepable promise to turn back the clock to a past that was never as great as advertised anyway. That's the falsehood at the core of this idea of make America great again. And we have a chance to stand for the idea that you don't get an honest or constructive politics that centers around the concept of, again, that if there are things and people in our own past we want to emulate, the thing we most ought to emulate about them is how focused they were on the future. And that's why I'm always talking about what America is going to look like in 2054 when, God willing, I get to the current age of the current president. Because a message that makes sense in 2054 is, by definition, one that can't just revolve around the deficiencies of the current White House, but actually explains the better America that White House is preventing us from getting to. And I believe that better America is available to us if we have the right kind of people and the right kind of policies, and a new generation of leadership. And what I'm finding is that we have the makings of a generational alliance. It's not the generational conflict of the 1960s, people marching against their parents. What I saw in South Bend when we had the March for Our Lives, led by high school students, with people like me just there to cheer them on, what I saw when we had the Women's March in our community was that you had young people leading the way, and you had people my parents' age and their grandparents' age at their side, boosting them and lifting them up. And that's what I see, that's what I feel in places from Iowa to South Carolina as we visit the early states that are such a big part of this process. We're doing it with a new vocabulary, not new values. Our values are the right values. They're why I'm a Democrat, and we shouldn't change them. And we especially shouldn't listen to anybody who thinks we have to change them in order to win. Because in order to win, you have to deserve to win. And in order to deserve to win, you got to stick to what's right. But we could be talking about things in a different way. And that's what we're trying to do on this campaign. It's why you hear me talking so much about freedom. Trying to take back freedom from being the property of one political party. A political party that cares about freedom in a sincere way, but only thinks of it as freedom from government. And forgets that sometimes you need good government to secure freedom, just as much as a bad government can take your freedom away. Because you're not free, if you don't have health care and you're never going to start that small business because you're afraid to walk away from the job you've already got. The freedom that you don't have if you can't organize for a good day's pay and working conditions for a good day's work. The freedom that you don't enjoy, and I see the Moms Demand Action folks here. I'm so glad you're flexing muscles as a group. The freedom that is taken away from you if you're not sure you're safe in your own school or that you're safe when you're dropping off your kids. That's freedom too. So is the ability to make your own healthcare decisions without a male boss or politician telling you what you ought to do. So let's talk about freedom in its richest sense. And let's talk about security in its deepest sense, which in the 21st century is going to be a lot more complicated than something you can solve by putting up a wall from sea to shining sea. That's not going to help us with cybersecurity challenges. It's not going to help us with election security emergencies. It's not going to help us when climate security, and I don't have to tell anybody anywhere near the Mississippi River about this, climate security is as much a part of our ability to have a safe community and country in the 21st century as anything that I worked on when I was in uniform overseas. That's security too. We ought to call it for what it is. And so is democracy. It's freedom, democracy, and security all go together. And I think my party is called the Democratic Party for a reason. And yet our country's become a less democratic one in my lifetime. The march toward greater democracy has not been a one-way project. It's had reversals, and we're living through one of them. We are less democratic when people are blocked from being able to exercise their legitimate right to vote because their neighborhood or their race is associated with one party not doing as well. If it is your political strategy to make sure fewer people can vote, then you might want to examine your policies and ask why you're better off when fewer people are going to the polls in the first place. We've got to make sure that not only the forms of democracy that we are now talking about more and more, as we should, doing something about districts drawn to where voters are picking, politicians are picking their voters instead of the other way around, doing something about the role of money in politics, even if it includes a constitutional amendment to clear up the corporation problem. But also stuff that we've just tolerated, accepting the unacceptable, like the fact that our fellow U.S. citizens in D.C. or Puerto Rico don't get the same political representation we do, with frustrating and sometimes devastating results. We are tolerating the intolerable, and now's a chance to change that. Because I believe we're at one of those watershed moments in the life of the country. It happens every 30, 40, or 50 years. It happened with the onset of the New Deal and the arrival of FDR. It happened with the arrival of Ronald Reagan, who set out a conservative era that helps to explain even how democratic presidents behave for the entire time I've been alive. And that era has come to an end. And something new is beginning, and we don't yet know whether that will be something enlightened and progressive or whether it'll be something ugly like we got right now. That will be decided based on the choices we make in the next few years. And that's why I'm running, not just to win an election, but to lay the groundwork for us to win the era. Yes. So that we see even Republicans someday, God love them, acting according to principles that we share. And I believe that can happen again. So part of what it'll take for that to happen is for there to be an absolute thumping at the ballot box in 2020 for the current version of the Republican Party so that they can do some soul searching. The other part, I think, of what it's going to take is for us to remember how to describe what we believe in terms of everyday life. And I don't just mean the kind of political thing where you say, Susie up there in the rafters had this horror story happen to her, and it can't be a cliche. It's got to be real. But there are enough real stories in this room to remind us all of why politics actually matters. My own life has been shaped by the decisions of people in power. When I was packing my bags to go to Afghanistan and putting a letter marked just in case in a drawer where my folks knew where to find it, just in case, I knew for the rest of my life from that moment how the most important things we have are subject to the judgment of people who sit in those white buildings in Washington, because I was ordered to a foreign land by a U.S. president. On the best day of my life, my wedding day, that came to me because of a decision that was made. It came to me by the grace of a single vote on the U.S. Supreme Court. The most intimate thing in my life, and the most everyday thing in my life, because it's how I begin and end my day, is there because of a decision. And even some of the most vulnerable moments that we've experienced, that I've experienced certainly, during my parents' medical challenges and the recent loss of my father, was knowing that as hard as the choices before us were, we were free, made free, to think about these family challenges as a family focused on what was medically right for my parents, without having to wonder whether it was going to break our family financially because of a policy called Medicare. A policy driven by values, driven by the idea that when you reach a certain age, a medical condition like that shouldn't bankrupt you. And it's why I want more Americans, matter of fact, all Americans, to enjoy that same freedom. This is our lives, our everyday lives. They are at stake in the choices that are made. It's not about who looked good on cable or who got the best zinger off in the committee meeting. It's about how politics shapes life in its lived and truest sense. And the last thing it's going to take is a lot of hope. And I know it's not always fashionable to speak of hope after what we've been through as a country. But running for office is an act of hope. So is volunteering for somebody running for office. so is generously contributing to something. You don't do this if you don't believe it'll make a difference. That's why I'm doing it. That's why we're all doing this. And it will. It can. I mean, how else can you explain the fact that that a marriage like mine, which couldn't have existed 5 years ago in my own home state, was followed a few weeks ago by a top-tier U.S. presidential candidate announcing his candidacy and then being greeted by his husband on stage at the end of the speech. That's the world we live in. What's that?
Don't forget Time.
Oh, yeah. We're on the cover of Time magazine.
Comes out tomorrow.
Nice. All right.
Stop on the way.
Well, that's who I am and what I'm about, so let's just talk about whatever you think's important. Yeah.
I have something. So something my family struggles with, and I think a lot of people from our generation, is the cost of childcare.
Yes.
Especially high quality childcare. I'm actually in the field myself, and I work at a great center at the University of Minnesota, but there's no staff discount. My husband and I can't afford to send my children where I work, so we have to, send them somewhere else. So, how can we fix the problem of having affordable childcare, and also, the compensation of people in my field?
Yes.
So.
The way you asked the question almost brought out my whole answer, because I talk about it. Well, you're a walking example of. There's a three-legged stool, right? There's quality of the child care. There's affordability of it. And then there's compensation of the people who work in the field. I meet a lot of people now who are basically working for the purpose of being able to afford having their child in childcare for the purpose of making it possible for them to work. Which is not exactly what we had in mind when we kind of built out this structure. It's okay to have a mixed delivery system, but we've got to make sure that we're actually providing support. And there's no way to have affordability and adequate compensation at the same time unless the federal government is willing to make an investment. Now, I think that investment pays off. I know it pays off. There's a lot of talk about the deficit and the debt. And even though it's not fashionable to talk of those things on my side of the aisle, I do think they matter. But there's two kinds of deficits then. There's stuff like tax cuts for the wealthiest, which basically widens the deficit without improving it. And then there's spending that actually pays for itself. And we know that the investments we make in healthier children and children being better off, those come back to us in so many different ways that even to the Treasury, you're going to be made whole in the long run. So it means we need to expand through grants to supplement the compensation of teachers writ large, and through what I would favor a tax credit system that can basically expand a child allowance to help people be able to afford those costs. But those policy moves plus a culture that actually values this profession that you're in is what it's going to have to take for us to have the next generation be strong enough to deal with the challenges that the failures of our generation is going to put on them. So thanks for what you're doing, patiently working in that field, and help us on the way.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So my topic that's near and dear to my heart is mental health.
Yeah.
It'll be 3 years in July that my best friend took her life. She died of suicide. The day that she died, a friend of ours who was very concerned about her mental health took her to a doctor twice that day. Within like 2 hours, describing her paranoia, describing just she wasn't sleeping, describing she had just changed her medication. My friend was well employed. My friend had a lot of insurance. My friend was clearly paranoid. The nurses were even looking at my friend like there's something wrong. And twice, the first time the doctor asked my friend, "Are you going to hurt yourself?" She said no. He said, "There's nothing more I can do." My friend brought her back. She said, she needs help. He said, "Well, we could take her to Fairview or Southdale. There's nothing I can do." And that night my friend went home and killed herself. And mental health, the suicide rates are going up. If the cancer rates were going up or if the diabetes rates were going up, everyone would be up in arms and they would be doing walks and throwing money at the problem. When will mental health be treated like a real mental health problem?
Well, first of all, thanks for raising that, because one of the biggest problems has been the kind of silence around this issue. 1 in 5, 1 in 4 Americans is touched by mental health issues at some point in their lives. And you wouldn't think it, you wouldn't know it if more people weren't raising their voices. We need more people raising their voices. So that can't be an easy story to share, and I'm glad you have. And it points to why we need as a matter of policy, mental health parity, so that we establish for the purposes of coverage and for the purposes of care, that, look, if your friend showed up with symptoms of life-threatening heart disease,
She would have been admitted to the hospital
right away.
within a minute.
Exactly. But a life-threatening mental health symptom did not have that same parity. So, and part of the reason, of course, goes back to resources. So we need to have the right kind of investment in our coverage system. But as you said, your friend had coverage, and the system of care still wasn't there to take her there. So, look, not all of this can be legislated. Some of this is cultural. But we do know there are policy moves that you can make. I mean, this is something that, there's a lot of talk about accountable care in the context of the ACA. Part of what CMS can require of medical providers is some kind of certification that mental health parity is actually reached in the way they treat people who come in on the front end. Another issue is that a lot of the frontline providers on mental health are police officers and firefighters who have no training. They're not supposed to be caregivers. But we wind up going to them again and again and again because nobody else knows what to do with somebody having symptoms. So part of what we got to do is make sure this becomes part of routine training for first responders. But more importantly, first responders have to have somewhere to take you. And the backlogs and the wait lists on any kind of inpatient or residential mental health support are such that today, I mean, if a South Bend officer finds somebody, even with a life-threatening mental illness, they might not be able to have a place to take them. And again, that won't get better without federal investment. And of course, there are so many who don't enjoy the kind of coverage that would even make it possible to get treated, even if you cleared one of those wait lists or found one of those providers. And that's one of the things that I think the right kind of Medicare for All framework needs to incorporate.
Great.
Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I'm a high schooler at one of the local high schools here,
Great.
and I'm blessed enough to have parents that are involved in politics and tell me that I can make a difference in my government. But a lot of kids my age don't have that, and there really are no civics classes taught in our high schools today. And I think that's a major contributor to the problem of why people are so engaged in our politics and feel like they can't do anything. So my question is, what would you do to up the level of engagement and investment people of my age feel about their government, and what would you do to reintroduce civics classes in our schools?
Well, you're here, so that means you're ahead of the curve. I wish more people were as engaged as you are. At the local level, we've done things like we initiated a youth task force that invited young people from diverse backgrounds in different schools to come to the table, partly as an advisory body for me, but partly to make sure they understood how much power they had. It's especially at the local level, actually, that you can make a difference. I mean, I've seen votes in city council meetings, right? They go differently sometimes because young people who aren't even old enough to vote come and lift their voice and demand action around a certain issue. Again, one of the most moving things about the March for Our Lives and the Parkland students stepping up is it turns out that a generation that was in power was really moved to see a newer generation saying, hey, you're letting us down. And raising those voices too. And I think that's one of the reasons we're going to finally get to some breakthroughs on some of those issues. Part of it, as you said, is a direct, solvable problem, which is investing in civics. Trouble with civics, just like art education, is they're being treated like a luxury. And part of that is because we sometimes treat our schools as though they're there for the purpose of generating workers, and ignore the fact that they're also generating citizens. So, yeah, you need the skills to compete in a 21st century economy. But whatever your job's going to be, you also need the methods to understand the world around you and make a difference in it. And that's why I don't think we can afford to go without civics or arts education or any of the other things that are on the chopping block, because they're not favored by some of the standards that get pushed down from Washington. They're harder to test for, and they're just not considered as essential a priority. I was in a conversation once locally with somebody who said, we're behind in math, and this is true. We're behind in math and science and some of the STEM stuff. So we got to just focus on that because these kids in China, they're doing laps around us on that, and I'm sure they're not sitting around reading reading these high-minded theories. And I thought, well, we definitely need to do a better job on science and education. But, if they had more time to think about literature or humanities or civics or art, maybe they wouldn't be content to live in an authoritarian regime. Right? So this stuff really matters for our national character. And I believe part of what the Federal Department of Education should be doing, in addition to the idea that it should probably be led by somebody who believes in public education. But it should also be incentivizing and supporting the development of civics curriculum in our schools. So in the meantime, we'll just have to count on you to spread the word with your peers.
One man show.
All the way in the back.
Yeah, I have a question, not so much about policy, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on cultural changes. If we look, one of the things that I really like about your candidacy is you understand the complexity and the nuances in just about every issue.
Yeah.
And someone was talking about the mental health and daycare, and you look at teachers, and part of your answer was there needs to be cultural change in valuing those people that are providing those services. So I'm not asking for a plan, but I'm just asking what your thoughts are on how do you attack that aspect
Yes.
of the problem that affects so many of these really intractable problems.
Well, I think it's the most important and least understood function of the presidency. So one of the things I learned as mayor is there's, as I view it, three kind of areas to the job. There's the one that gets talked about the most, which is the policy part, crafting and implementing good policies. There's another part that's extremely important for any executive in government, which is management, just capably running a complicated administration, right? And then there's this third part. It's very hard to define, which is what you might call the moral or cultural part of the job, which is really about drawing people together and summoning our highest values, especially at times of trial or tension. And in different forms, people in any executive role in government feel that and live that. And I've had to do it in South Bend. Sometimes something gets presented as a tactical issue, and then you realize it's a moral issue. So, like, we got a phone call after those New Zealand shootings from a prominent member of the Muslim community in our city. Asking us Friday, it's a day of prayer, and on the surface, he was calling me to ask about security arrangements and asked that I make sure the police department was alerted to their needs in terms of getting ready for their evening events. And we took care of that. What I realized during the course of the call, and this is probably not something I would have caught my first year, but by my 8th year, I kind of have figured it out. What was really needed was an expression that the city welcomed everybody who was in it. And I realized as soon as I hung up the phone that I needed to write out a letter for the imam to read at the evening services on city letterhead, that had the mayor's name on it, with the city. And that's me in that symbolic capacity, saying that your community doesn't just accept you, it needs you. And that we're glad that you're here, not just exercising a right, but bearing a gift. And so, of course, we're going to protect you. And it's the part of the presidency whose loss, I think, is the most costly to us right now. It's why, with a rising tide of white nationalism, we're basically defenseless. Because the defenses against that, I can talk to you about, countering domestic terrorism and radicalization, but most of the defenses to that are cultural. And that's true for a lot of the biggest challenges that we face. So it's harder to, as a former consultant, it's harder for me to quantify, but I believe now it's the most important part of the job. And part of what we can do now as candidates, before the first vote is even cast, is model by the conduct of our campaigns. And since there's 20 of us, there's a lot of modeling that's going to go on. Modeling by the conduct of our campaigns what that different culture might look like if we were in charge. And we're determined to do that, and I think how each of us acts on our side of the aisle will be a powerful contrast to what we have right now in the White House.
Second?
Shifting gears a little bit,
Yeah.
could you give us your ideas about how we can regain the Rust Belt, including your state? And I don't know how South Bend voted in the last election, but I think it's a very key element to getting elected president.
Right. Yeah. So my county is characteristic of the Rust Belt in many ways. It was headquarters for Studebaker, and then when that collapsed in the '60s, it took us a half century to start to recover. My county should be one of the blue counties that Indiana Democrats can count on, but in the last presidential election, it went 50-50, and that was one of the warning signs that we weren't going to make it. So I think it's vitally important that our party find a way to reconnect with the industrial Midwest. Again, not by rewriting our values. Our values are the right ones, but I think in many ways by re-engaging the way that our values are universal. This doesn't have to mean walking away from our bedrock commitments around racial and social justice. It can't, because if that's required, I don't even know why we're out here.
How about economic?
Exactly. So substantively, we got to have a commitment on fairness that is the same as our belief in fairness that motivates our views on racial justice. That also explains how the economy is treating us. Look, our message to the industrial Midwest is we're the ones trying to get you a raise. Because we think the minimum wage ought to go up. We're the ones defending the role of labor. We're the ones trying to fight to keep your health care, and they're the ones trying to take it away. We're the ones who think that it's unacceptable that we're the only industrialized country without paid family leave policy. We're the ones who think that if you're moving into a gig economy, where you go through more employers in a week than my parents went through in a lifetime, that you've got to have a system of prorated portable benefits that makes you better off, where if you're 7 hours a week driving for Uber, then you take 7 divided by 40, and that's how much Uber owes and ought to contribute to your retirement, your vacation, and your health. These are things that I think people get, but they haven't been able to hear us. And not only do we have to reinforce our commitment to those economic issues, but it's going to take unbelievable discipline not to get drawn off of that by the antics of the president. Because when the president does something wrong, we got to say so. But then we got to move back to what it is we'd be doing differently. Otherwise, it'll distract everybody from what they're doing.
Do you see yourself different from Biden in terms of your approach towards the West Bill?
In some ways, I think I represented maybe a different messenger. Well, I definitely represented a different messenger. But look, the substance, 80% of the substance of what the Democratic candidates have to say is going to be pretty similar. It's going to converge. There will be some differences on the margins. There will be some disagreements, some differences in priorities. But a lot of it, I think, is just about the messenger. And I think one thing the Democratic Party could do is, actually put up a candidate who lives in a middle-class neighborhood in the industrial Midwest and see if that doesn't help. Sorry, you didn't. All right. You get the last word.
Okay. My nephew Daniel is a 6th grade science teacher at St. Anthony de Padua.
Fantastic.
In South Bend.
Oh, wow. Our St. Anthony.
Yeah.
That's great.
Your St. Anthony.
Good.
And he's the one who he's very enthusiastic. And so I said,
Good.
what should I ask him? Huh? So he gave me 6 very scientific questions. Very detailed, which I won't ask you, but his major concern, he's got a 2-year-old girl and a 3-month-old girl. His concern is what he calls climate catastrophe.
Yeah.
And what is your, I won't ask you the specific, he did mention carbon removal, which I hadn't heard of before, but, can you talk a little bit about what you think about that and a vision or something?
Right, so I think anyone who wants to talk about the future has to talk about climate, first and foremost. And we can't talk about it like a far-off issue anymore, right? Because it's starting to affect us right now.
Yeah.
I mean, twice now I've had to fire up the Emergency Operations Center in South Bend for a flood. One of them was a 1,000-year flood, and the other one was a 500-year flood.
Yeah.
And your nephew, as a teacher, could compute the statistical odds of having those two things happen 18 months apart.
He likes math.
Good. If my math is right, it's 125,000 to 1, which either means I've got ridiculous luck, or things are changing around us. They're changing beneath us, and it's only going to get worse. So I'll tell you my substantive answer, and then I'll tell you my political answer. They rhyme with each other, but I think we need to talk about both. So substantively, what we need to do is recognize this as a massive national emergency, and use it to summon the energies of this nation into a national project. We need a national project. And for once, we have a national project that doesn't involve fighting other human beings. So it's kind of nice that way. And we can marshal the resources of our economy and our research institutions and our government and our private sector to do something about it. Now, it'll take specific policies to do each of those. One of them is a carbon fee and dividend, carbon tax, whatever you want to call it. There has to be a price assigned to carbon. And by the way, we can do this in a very progressive way. We can rebate it right back out to people. But it'll change the price signal so that you see the true cost of some of these high emitting activities. We've got to do that. Won't be politically easy, but we've got to do it. We've got to massively invest in R&D probably at least quadruple what we're doing right now as a country, which would put us more on par with the Manhattan Project or a moon landing. That was a national project, and this is, if that was worth it, this definitely is. What do we spend it on? Reducing the cost of renewables. What you were talking about, carbon storage, because realistically, it's actually easier to get to net zero carbon than it is to get to absolute zero carbon by finding ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. We already have that in trees, but there may be more sophisticated ways to do it. We've got to invest in building retrofits. It's an idea that creates a lot of jobs in the building trades too, so it's very attractive. We've got to invest in alternative energy sources, and we've got to lead the world on this. We've got to convene. If I were doing a global summit, I'd start by getting our cities and states together to get them to make commitments. So before we even go out to the rest of the world, we get the cities and states that have most of the economy and most of the people among them. Well, the states, I have all of them, but the cities, a relatively small handful of mayors can speak for a large chunk of the economy. And get the cities to make some commitments, and then add them up to what we have to offer as a country. And there are other things we can do rule-wise and legislatively, and maybe even change the structure of how our government manages this, so it's not spread across different agencies. So that's the policy answer.
Yeah.
The political answer is we've got to change what goes through somebody's mind when we say the word climate change. So if you close your eyes right now and you picture climate change and you imagine the B-roll on CNN, chances are you're picturing the Arctic, right? Polar bears, ice shelves, stuff like that. And psychologically, the problem is most of us have never been to the Arctic. And so we don't think of it as a here and now kind of thing. But when parts of Nebraska are underwater and parts of California catch fire, and fellow mayors are telling me about what they're dealing with sea level rise in their Florida communities today, that means this is not something that's happening to somebody else somewhere else. This is happening to us right now. And we've got to talk about it in those terms, those concrete, on the ground, in our lives, in our faces terms, so people understand this to be an emergency. But if we get it right, then it will be something, not just a challenge that we face, but something we'll be really proud of how we dealt with it. It is the project of my generation. It has to be.
He's your age, exactly.
And good, well, tell him I'm working on it.
All right.
And that's on our hand. I know we said no more questions, but I got this young man's been really patient right in front of me, so I don't think I can say no to you.
So, what could me as an 11-year-old or my generation do to help climate change?
All right, did you hear that? You already understand the problem, and you want to do something about it. So
And it's going to
that's a big
affect
part.
you.
Again, I'm going to end with a political answer, but I'll end with that, okay? Because politics of this are important, but that's not all there is to it. Part of it's learning, right? So the more you understand right now about science and how the world actually works, the more you're going to be able to make good decisions when you're president or running a company or whatever it is you're going to do. Another thing you need to do is talk to others, because people your age listen mostly to other people your age. But parents listen to their kids. This is a secret. You might not know this. It might not seem this way when you have a difference of opinion with your parents, but parents listen to their kids a lot more than you would think. And chances are your parents already get it too on this issue. Maybe. Yeah? You think so? Okay. Probably. All right. But maybe some of your friends' parents don't. And so the more you organize and share ideas with people your age, the more you're bringing ideas into other homes and helping people maybe even vote differently one day. There are also some things you can do right now. For example, at school, you could ask your teacher, hey, have we done anything to change the light bulbs in this classroom, or the way the thermostats work in this building, so that they use less energy? Have we thought about offsetting the carbon of something? If we take a school trip somewhere, and they would make you sell candy bars for a school trip or anything like that, and they would try to enlist you in fundraising, it'll happen one day. Yeah? Maybe raise a little extra and use it to invest in a carbon offset. That's where, for example, you pay a little bit to plant some trees that'll counteract the exhaust from the car that you're in, something like that. But the biggest thing, and the political part I want to mention is, it's really hard to look into the eyes of an 11-year-old and tell them something that isn't true. And so you have a kind of moral authority at the age of 11. I don't know if you have a vote yet, but you already have a kind of power to make somebody think. And so whenever you encounter somebody in a position of authority, whether it's one of your friend's parents or a local elected official that you meet out in the community, or someone in a position of responsibility at your school, like a principal, or the occasional presidential candidate, you have a chance to ask them the question you just asked me, and also the question of what we're going to do about it, and hold us accountable. Because the biggest thing that goes through my mind when a person your age asks me a question is, do not let this kid down. So you can help keep us on the right path there, all right?
Right.
All right.
All right.
Thank Say hi to St. Anthony. Yeah, all the great ones here, right?
Thank you for asking the question because that was, we have 5 years. We have 5 years before it's over. I just read an article, 5 years.
And I just read all the questions.
No, you did perfect. You did right. You did.
I'm so glad. I don't know what you said. Hopefully somebody
Ready? Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you guys.